Ready for a revolutionary war marriage of convenience that becomes anything but convenient? When a desperate widow needs protection and a battle-weary soldier needs a new start, their fake arrangement sparks real passion that could change everything. This heartwarming tale proves that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships lead to the deepest love. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell for more historical romances where love blooms from the most practical beginnings. The Arrangement of Hearts. Chapter 1. A Desperate Proposition. The advertisement in the Pennsylvania Gazette was tucked between notices for runaway horses and announcements of land auctions. Written in the careful script of someone accustomed to teaching children their letters, but unaccustomed to advertising for a husband. Martha Henley read it one more time before folding the newspaper with hands that trembled despite her determination to appear composed and practical about what she was proposing. Respectable widow, age 26, seeks arrangement with honorable gentleman for purposes of legal protection. Schoolteacher with 40 acres of fertile land requires married status to maintain property rights under Pennsylvania law. Accommodation, meals, and fair compensation provided in exchange for name and presence only. No matrimonial obligations expected beyond legal formalities. Inquire at Henley Farm, 3 miles east of Lancaster. It was the most scandalous thing Martha had ever done, and also the most necessary. Pennsylvania's property laws, progressive as they were compared to other colonies, still required women to have male guardians or husbands to maintain independent ownership of significant holdings. When her husband David had died of fever the previous winter, Martha had assumed she could continue managing their farm and school as she had been doing for the past 3 years. She had not anticipated that David's brother Edmund would arrive from Virginia with legal documents asserting his claim to the property as the deceased's nearest male relative. Edmund Henley was everything his brother had not been: grasping, opportunistic, and possessed of the kind of casual cruelty that made Martha's skin crawl whenever he visited to check on the property. He had made it clear that his intention was to sell the farm and use the proceeds to finance his own commercial ventures, leaving Martha with nothing but whatever charity her relatives might provide. The school she had worked so hard to establish would disappear along with the farm, depriving the local children of the only formal education available within 20 miles. The legal situation was complicated by the ongoing war, which had disrupted normal court proceedings and left many property disputes in limbo, while judges and magistrates were called away for military service. Edmund's Virginia connections provided him with legal representation that Martha couldn't afford to challenge, especially since her own funds were tied up in the contested property. Her only hope was to marry someone whose legal standing would supersede Edmund's claim and whose presence would discourage further harassment. Finding such a person was the problem. Most unmarried men in the area were away fighting with the Continental Army or had already been claimed by women in less desperate circumstances. The few remaining bachelors were either too young to provide effective protection or too old to seem plausible as romantic partners to anyone who might investigate the arrangement. Martha needed someone who could convincingly play the role of devoted husband while respecting the boundaries of what was essentially a business contract. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her brooding, and Martha looked up from her kitchen table to see a lone rider approaching the farmhouse. He was clearly a soldier. His posture and the way he managed his horse spoke of military training, but his uniform was so travel-stained and patched that identifying his allegiance required careful observation. As he drew closer, she could make out the faded blue coat and brass buttons that marked him as Continental Army, probably returning from one of the campaigns that had been ranging across Pennsylvania for the past 2 years. Martha smoothed her apron and checked that her cap was properly in place before stepping onto the front porch to greet her visitor. The soldier dismounted with the careful movements of someone favoring old injuries, and when he removed his tricorn hat, she could see a face marked by exhaustion and something that might have been cautious hope. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who had spent months on short rations and long marches. His brown hair was tied back in a military queue, and his clean-shaven face bore the kind of weathered look that came from extended exposure to outdoor life. But it was his eyes that caught Martha's attention, grey-blue and intelligent, with a directness that suggested honesty and a wariness that spoke of difficult experiences. "Ma'am," he said, approaching the porch with respectful caution, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I saw the advertisement in the Lancaster paper, and I wondered if I might speak with you about the arrangement you mentioned." Martha felt her heart begin to race, though whether from relief or apprehension she couldn't determine. "Of course. Please come in. May I offer you some refreshment? You look as though you've been travelling for some time." "That's very kind of you, ma'am. I'm Major Samuel Webb, late of the 4th Pennsylvania Regiment." He followed her into the farmhouse's main room, his eyes taking in the neat furnishings and the stack of children's primer books that marked her profession. "And yes, I've been travelling for the better part of a week since my discharge from service." Martha busied herself preparing tea and arranging what food she could offer, using the domestic activities to cover her assessment of this unexpected visitor. Major Webb carried himself with the bearing of an officer and gentleman, but there was something humble about his manner that suggested he had learned hard lessons about the distance between rank and actual authority in the chaotic world of revolutionary warfare. "You mentioned discharge," Martha said carefully as she set refreshments before him. "May I ask, are you finished with military service permanently?" "Yes, ma'am. Medical discharge following the winter at Valley Forge and wounds sustained during the Monmouth campaign." Webb's voice carried matter-of-fact acceptance rather than self-pity. "Nothing permanently disabling, but sufficient to convince my superiors that I'd be more useful to the cause as a civilian than as an active soldier." The admission explained the careful way he moved and the lines of pain that occasionally flickered across his features. Martha found herself studying his face more closely, noting the intelligence and integrity that seemed to characterize his expressions. If his military service was accurate, and his bearing suggested it was, then he possessed exactly the kind of respectable background that would make their arrangement credible to outside observers. "Major Webb," Martha began, settling across from him at the kitchen table, "I should be direct about what I'm proposing. This would be a marriage of convenience only, designed to provide me with legal protection and you with, well, whatever compensation and accommodation we might agree upon. I'm not seeking a romantic relationship or traditional matrimonial duties." Webb nodded thoughtfully, seeming unsurprised by her directness. "I appreciate your frankness, Mrs. Henley. Might I ask what specific legal protection you require?" "The advertisement mentioned property rights, but I'd like to understand the full scope of what you're facing." Martha explained the situation with Edmund's claim on the farm, the threat to her school, and the legal complications created by wartime disruptions to normal judicial processes. As she spoke, she found herself appreciating Webb's intelligent questions and the way he grasped both the practical and emotional aspects of her predicament. "Your brother-in-law sounds like the sort of man who preys on others' misfortunes," Webb observed when she had finished. "I've encountered his type in the army, men who see crisis as opportunity for personal advancement at others' expense." "Have you indeed?" Martha asked, surprised by the personal edge in his voice. "My own family's property in western Pennsylvania was appropriated by such men while I was away fighting for the independence they now profit from," Webb replied quietly. "I returned to find my farm sold for taxes I couldn't pay while serving without salary, my livestock scattered, and my belongings distributed among neighbors who thought I was dead." The revelation created a moment of shared understanding that transformed their conversation from business negotiation to recognition of mutual vulnerability. Both had been betrayed by people who should have protected their interests. Both faced uncertain futures in a world disrupted by war and social upheaval. "So you have your own reasons for seeking this arrangement," Martha said softly. "I need a place to rebuild my life, Mrs. Henley. The army taught me many things, but it didn't prepare me for returning to a civilian world where everything I once knew has changed." Webb paused, studying her face with careful attention. "If you're willing to provide shelter and honest employment, I can offer protection, assistance with whatever work needs doing, and absolute respect for whatever boundaries you choose to establish." The proposition was more appealing than Martha had dared to hope. Webb seemed to understand exactly what she needed without requiring lengthy explanations or emotional confessions. More importantly, he appeared to offer genuine partnership rather than the patriarchal domination she had feared from most potential responses to her advertisement. "There would be practical considerations," Martha continued. "We would need to present a convincing appearance of matrimonial affection to anyone who might investigate our arrangement. Edmund has connections who might attempt to prove fraud if they suspected deception. I understand public displays of affection, shared accommodation that appears legitimate, consistent stories about how we met and why we married." Webb's military background was evident in his systematic approach to operational details. "How long do you anticipate this arrangement would need to continue?" Martha had been dreading this question because she didn't have a satisfactory answer. "Until the legal situation is resolved and my ownership of the property is secure. That could be months or possibly years, depending on how quickly normal court procedures are restored after the war ends." Webb was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing the implications of committing to an arrangement of indefinite duration. When he spoke, his voice carried resolve rather than reluctance. "Mrs. Henley, if you're willing to accept me as your husband in name, I'm prepared to honor that commitment for as long as necessary. I have nowhere else to go and nothing better to do than help a fellow victim of wartime injustice. Subscribe for the next chapter of this Revolutionary War marriage of convenience. Will their business arrangement survive the first test when Edmund arrives to challenge Martha's new husband? Click the notification bell so you never miss our heartwarming historical romances where practical partnerships become passionate love stories." Chapter 2. The Art of Deception. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later in the small Lutheran church outside Lancaster, attended by a handful of neighbors who'd been carefully selected for their tendency to gossip and their connections to the broader community that would need to accept the marriage as legitimate. Martha wore her best dress, a simple but well-made gown of deep blue wool that had served for special occasions since before David's death, while Samuel appeared in his dress uniform, cleaned and mended for the occasion. Reverend Mueller performed the ceremony with the same solemn dignity he brought to all his pastoral duties, apparently untroubled by the unusual circumstances that had brought this particular couple before his altar. Martha had explained the situation honestly, emphasizing the legal necessity rather than romantic motivations, and the elderly minister had nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen war disrupt many traditional arrangements. "Marriage is both a spiritual covenant and a practical partnership," he had counseled during their brief pre-ceremony consultation. "In times like these, perhaps the practical aspects serve God's will as much as romantic passion. You are both honorable people seeking to protect what is rightfully yours and to build something positive from difficult circumstances." As they spoke their vows, Martha found herself studying Samuel's face, noting the serious attention he brought to promises they both knew were primarily legal formalities. His voice was steady and clear as he pledged to love, honor, and protect her, though his eyes carried acknowledgement of the complex reality underlying these traditional words. When it came time for Martha to make her own vows, she discovered that speaking them felt less like deception and more like expression of genuine hope for their partnership. The kiss that sealed their marriage was brief and formal, but Martha felt an unexpected warmth in the gentle pressure of Samuel's lips against hers. It was her first kiss since David's death, her first physical intimacy with any man except her late husband, and the sensation was both familiar and surprisingly pleasant. After the ceremony, they returned to the farm for a simple celebration with their witnesses, neighbors who had brought food and small gifts in honor of the occasion. Samuel played his part perfectly, treating Martha with the attentive courtesy of a devoted new husband, while maintaining the subtle reserve appropriate to a couple still learning to navigate married life together. "Mrs. Webb," he said formally when they were alone in the kitchen after their guests had departed, "I hope today wasn't too difficult for you. I know this arrangement requires considerable adjustment for both of us." The new name startled Martha more than she had expected. After 3 years of widowhood, being called by a husband's name felt both strange and somehow comforting. "Please, call me Martha. If we're to live as married people, we should probably use given names rather than formal addresses." "Of course, and I'm Samuel, or Sam if you prefer." He paused, studying her expression with the careful attention she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "Martha, we should probably discuss practical arrangements for sleeping and other domestic matters. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable in your own home." It was a conversation Martha had been dreading, though she appreciated his thoughtfulness in raising it directly rather than allowing awkward uncertainty to develop. There's a small room off the kitchen that served as David's study. It has a bed where he would rest when he was working late on farm accounts, if that would be acceptable. "Perfectly acceptable. I'm accustomed to military accommodations, which are considerably less comfortable than anything you could provide." Samuel's relief was evident, suggesting he had been as concerned about domestic arrangements as she had been. They spent the evening establishing routines and expectations that would allow them to coexist peacefully, while maintaining the appearance of a normal marriage. Samuel would handle the heavier farm work that had been challenging for Martha to manage alone, while she would continue teaching and managing the household. They would take meals together and present themselves as a united couple when dealing with neighbors or any officials who might investigate their situation. The first test of their arrangement came sooner than expected. 2 days after the wedding, Edmund Henley arrived unannounced with a Philadelphia lawyer in tow, clearly intending to catch Martha in circumstances that would support his legal challenges. Instead, he found her working in the kitchen garden while Samuel repaired fence posts nearby, a scene of domestic partnership that provided no ammunition for accusations of impropriety or deception. "Martha," Edmund said with barely concealed hostility, approaching the garden where she was harvesting late vegetables, "I heard rumors about some hasty marriage ceremony. I thought it best to investigate personally." Martha straightened from her work, brushing dirt from her apron with deliberate calm. "Edmund, how thoughtful of you to call. I'd like you to meet my husband, Samuel Webb. Samuel, this is David's brother Edmund, whom I've mentioned." Samuel approached from the fence line with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command authority, his hand extended in polite greeting despite the obvious tension of the situation. "Mr. Henley, Martha has told me a great deal about you. I'm pleased to finally make your acquaintance." Edmund shook the offered hand with obvious reluctance, his eyes taking in Samuel's military bearing and the confident way he positioned himself protectively near Martha. "Major Webb, is it? Rather sudden, this marriage. I hope you'll understand my concern for my late brother's widow." "Of course. Family concern is natural and commendable," Samuel replied smoothly. Though I should point out that Martha is no longer your brother's widow. She's my wife, which I believe changes the legal situation considerably." The lawyer Edmund had brought, a thin, sharp-faced man named Morrison, stepped forward with the officious manner of someone accustomed to intimidating people with legal jargon. "Major Webb, I trust you're aware that hasty marriages for purposes of property manipulation can be challenged in court. Pennsylvania law provides remedies for fraudulent arrangements designed to circumvent legitimate inheritance claims." Samuel's expression didn't change, but Martha noticed a subtle shift in his posture that suggested military training in dealing with hostile negotiations. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it? I'm familiar with Pennsylvania property law, having studied it extensively while preparing to establish my own household here. I'm also familiar with military law regarding fraud and deception, having prosecuted several such cases during my service. I can assure you that my marriage to Martha is entirely legitimate and properly documented." The calm authority in Samuel's voice clearly caught both Edmund and his lawyer off guard. They had expected to find either a timid woman trying to manage legal complexities beyond her understanding, or perhaps some local opportunist who could be easily intimidated. Instead, they faced a former military officer who spoke their language and seemed unimpressed by their attempts at legal bullying. "Major Webb," Edmund said, his voice taking on a more cautious tone, "perhaps we should discuss this matter privately, man to man, as it were." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Samuel replied pleasantly. "Martha and I have agreed to handle all matters concerning our property jointly. Anything you wish to discuss with me can certainly be discussed in her presence." The visible unity between them was clearly frustrating Edmund's strategy, which had apparently been based on exploiting Martha's isolation and legal vulnerability. Faced with a husband who seemed both knowledgeable and protective, Edmund's position became considerably weaker. After 20 minutes of increasingly futile attempts to find legal or practical weaknesses in Martha and Samuel's situation, Edmund and his lawyer departed with obvious frustration and vague threats about further investigation. Martha watched their carriage disappear down the road with a mixture of relief and continuing apprehension. "Do you think they'll challenge us in court?" she asked Samuel as they watched their unwelcome visitors leave. "Probably, but their position is much weaker now than it was before our marriage. Edmund's claim was based on your legal vulnerability as an unmarried woman. Now that you have a husband to represent your interests, he'll need to prove actual fraud or find some other basis for his claims." Samuel paused, studying her worried expression. "Martha, I meant what I said about handling these matters jointly. We're partners in this arrangement, which means you don't have to face these challenges alone anymore." The reassurance in his words created an unexpected warmth in Martha's chest. For the first time since David's death, she felt genuinely protected rather than merely defended. Samuel's presence had transformed her from a vulnerable woman fighting alone against powerful opponents into half of a partnership that could meet challenges with confidence and mutual support. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I had hoped this arrangement would provide legal protection, but I hadn't anticipated how much difference it would make to simply have someone standing beside me when facing people like Edmund." Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his serious features into something approaching warmth. "That's what husbands are for, even fictional ones, though I have to admit the fictional part is becoming less clear to me with each day that passes." "Oh, don't miss the next chapter. Will Martha and Samuel's growing closeness survive the increasing scrutiny of their arrangement? What happens when their fake marriage starts feeling surprisingly real? Subscribe now and hit the bell icon for more Revolutionary War romance, where convenience becomes the foundation for lasting love. Chapter 3. When Pretense Becomes Truth. The autumn harvest season brought both welcome prosperity and unexpected intimacy to Martha and Samuel's carefully constructed arrangement. Working side by side to bring in the corn, preserve vegetables for winter, and prepare the farm for colder weather created a domestic partnership that felt increasingly natural, despite its unconventional origins. Samuel proved to be not only capable with heavy farm work, but also knowledgeable about crop rotation, livestock management, and the dozen practical skills that separated successful farmers from those who merely hoped for good weather. Martha's school had reopened with 14 students, children from families scattered across the surrounding townships who walked miles each day for the privilege of learning reading, writing, and basic mathematics from the county's only certified teacher. Samuel often appeared during recess periods to help with maintenance projects around the schoolhouse, his presence providing both practical assistance and subtle demonstration that Martha's marriage was genuine and ongoing. Mrs. Webb, 8-year-old Rebecca Patterson, had asked during one such visit, "Is Major Webb really a war hero like my father says?" Martha glanced toward Samuel, who was replacing loose boards on the schoolhouse steps with the methodical precision that characterized all his work. "What makes your father think that, Rebecca?" "Papa says any man who survived Valley Forge and Monmouth and still walks straight must have been very brave or very lucky. He says Major Webb has the look of someone who's seen hard fighting but came through with his honor intact." The conversation reminded Martha how little she actually knew about Samuel's military service beyond the basic facts he had shared during their initial meeting. Their evening conversations had focused on practical matters, farm management, legal strategies for dealing with Edmund's continued harassment, plans for expanding the school, rather than the personal histories that shaped their individual perspectives on life. That evening, as they shared their usual simple dinner in the farmhouse kitchen, Martha found herself studying Samuel's face more closely, noting details that suggested Rebecca's father might be correct about the nature of his war experiences. The careful way he held his left shoulder, the thin scar along his jaw that she was only now noticing, the occasional distant expression that suggested memories he preferred not to revisit. "Samuel," she said during a lull in their conversation about the next day's work, "would you mind if I asked about your service? I realize it might be painful to discuss, but I find myself curious about the experiences that shaped you into the man I've come to know." Samuel paused in his eating, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth as he considered her request. "What specifically would you like to know?" "Whatever you're comfortable sharing." "Rebecca Patterson's father seems to think you were involved in some significant battles. Your own comments about Valley Forge suggest you endured considerable hardship. I suppose I'm wondering how those experiences influence your perspective on what we're trying to build here." It was a more personal question than either of them had ventured during their weeks of careful coexistence, and Martha wasn't entirely sure what had prompted her to ask it. Perhaps it was the growing sense that their arrangement was evolving into something deeper than legal convenience, requiring more honest communication if it was to succeed long-term. Samuel set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, his grey eyes reflecting the candlelight as he seemed to weigh how much truth their relationship could bear. "Valley Forge nearly killed me, Martha. Not from enemy action, but from the slow grinding down of everything that makes a man feel human. Cold, hunger, disease, watching good men die from preventable suffering while politicians argued about supplies and funding." His voice carried matter-of-fact acceptance rather than self-pity, but Martha could hear the underlying pain that such experiences had created. "At Monmouth, I took a British bayonet in the shoulder and a musket ball in the leg. Spent 3 months in a field hospital, wondering if I'd ever walk normally again, much less return to duty." "But you did return to duty," Martha observed, for another year, until my superiors decided I was more liability than asset. Physical limitations, but also other problems. Samuel paused, his expression growing troubled. I started questioning orders that seemed designed more to advance officers' careers than to serve the cause we were supposedly fighting for. That kind of attitude doesn't make for reliable subordinates. The admission revealed another layer to Samuel's character, not just physical courage, but moral courage that had apparently created conflicts with military hierarchy. Martha found herself respecting him even more for maintaining principles that had clearly cost him professionally. "Is that why you were attracted to our arrangement?" Martha asked gently. "The opportunity to build something positive rather than simply follow orders that served others' interests?" Samuel smiled, the expression carrying both sadness and genuine warmth. "Partly, yes, but also because you reminded me that there are still people in the world worth protecting, causes worth serving that don't require violence or compromise with corruption." He paused, studying her face in the flickering candlelight. "Martha, I should probably tell you something about how I view our situation." Indeed, the serious tone in his voice made Martha's heart begin to race with anticipation and apprehension. "What do you mean?" "I mean that what began as a practical arrangement has become something more significant for me. I find myself caring about your welfare in ways that go beyond our legal agreement. I look forward to our conversations, I take pride in the work we do together, and I've begun to think of this place as home rather than temporary shelter." Martha felt her breath catch as Samuel put words to feelings she had been experiencing but hadn't dared to acknowledge. The comfortable domesticity they had developed, the way they had learned to anticipate each other's needs and preferences, the growing sense of partnership in facing challenges, all of it had indeed evolved beyond mere convenience into something that felt remarkably like genuine affection. "Samuel," she said slowly, "I've been having similar thoughts. When Edmund and his lawyer visited, watching you stand beside me and speak for our interests, it felt natural in ways I hadn't expected. Not like you were playing a role, but like you genuinely cared about protecting what we've built together." "I do care," Samuel said firmly, "more than I probably should, given the terms of our original agreement." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge that, once crossed, would change their relationship irrevocably. Martha found herself studying Samuel's face, noting the honesty and vulnerability in his expression, the way his hands rested carefully on the table as if he were restraining himself from reaching toward her. "What would it mean," Martha asked carefully, "if we acknowledged that our feelings have changed, that this arrangement has become something neither of us anticipated? It would mean admitting that the marriage we entered for legal protection has become a marriage in truth. It would mean accepting that we're no longer partners in deception, but partners in building a genuine life together." Samuel's voice carried both hope and uncertainty. But it would also mean renegotiating everything about our relationship, including the boundaries we established to protect each other's independence. Martha considered this, weighing the security of their current arrangement against the possibilities and risks of acknowledging deeper feelings. The practical woman, who had survived widowhood and legal challenges, urged caution, but the heart that had been slowly awakening over the past months urged honesty and courage. "Samuel," she said finally, "would you be willing to court your own wife, to see if what we've built on practical foundations might support something more romantic and permanent?" Samuel's smile was immediate and radiant, transforming his serious features into something that made Martha's heart skip in her chest. "Martha Webb, I would be honored to court you properly, though I should warn you that I'm out of practice with romantic gestures and sweet speeches. Then it's fortunate that I'm more interested in genuine affection than elaborate courtship rituals, Martha replied, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the kitchen fire. Perhaps we could begin with simple honesty about our feelings and see where that leads us. Before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and Martha felt the familiar chill of apprehension that now accompanied any unexpected visitors. Through the window, she could see torches and the silhouettes of multiple riders approaching the farmhouse with what looked like official authority. Samuel rose immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward where his sword would have hung during military service. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, moving toward the front door with the alert caution of someone trained to assess and respond to potential threats. The lead rider dismounted and approached the porch with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. When he spoke, his voice carried the official tone of legal proceedings rather than social calling. "Major Samuel Webb, Mrs. Martha Webb, I'm Constable Williams from Lancaster County. I have a warrant requiring your presence at tomorrow's court session regarding claims against this property. Subscribe for the stunning conclusion. Will Martha and Samuel's newfound love survive the legal battle for their farm? Can their growing bond withstand the ultimate test of their arrangement? Hit the notification bell for the final chapter that reveals whether love built on practical foundations can prove stronger than romance built on passion alone.